They told the world a story, a carefully polished, multi-billion-dollar narrative about inspiration, about rising from nothing, about authenticity. They framed her as the voice of the voiceless, a woman who defied all odds and somehow remained, untouched by the greed, ego, and backroom dealings that corrupt so many at the top. For decades, the public believed it. They bought into every interview, every tearful revelation, every moment that felt so real on camera. But beneath all that, sparkle and sincerity was a truth far more uncomfortable. And recently, that truth came crashing into the spotlight when one bold woman decided enough was enough. When the cameras turned on, she didn't come with vague accusations or dramatic gestures. She came with facts, cold, hard, meticulously documented facts. In an era where optics matter more than substance, she brought substance that shattered the optics into pieces. The audience could feel it from the first few minutes. This wasn't a political stunt or a viral media grab. This was a reckoning. The way the narrative unraveled was almost surgical. Piece by piece, she deconstructed the myth. Financial records? Presented. Business ties with highly questionable figures? Exposed. Public statements that contradicted private actions? Laid bare. It wasn't done with fury. It was done with focus, precision, determination, and that made it even more devastating. People had always assumed the public image matched the private one. That's what made the revelation so painful for many. When someone holds themselves up as a moral compass for a generation, as a symbol of empowerment and healing, the betrayal stings deeper. It's not just disappointment, it's disillusionment. What made the moment even more powerful was how calmly the truth was revealed. No shouting, no grandstanding, just undeniable evidence, and a steady voice delivering it to a nation that didn't realize it had been lied to for years. As the crowd sat in stunned silence, the weight of it all started to sink in. It wasn't just about one individual, it was about what happens when society worships personalities instead of principles. When fame becomes a shield that protects people from accountability, when charisma outweighs character. This moment cracked that system wide open. The audience wasn't just listening, they were feeling something shift. You could sense it, the way people leaned in, the way some gasped when the details came out. Not tabloid fodder, not gossip, but deep structural contradictions between the story that had been told and the reality hiding behind it. The truth wasn't hidden in some obscure corner. It was there all along, tucked into public filings, buried under corporate layers, camouflaged by charity events and emotional monologues. It just took someone brave enough to go looking for it and bold enough to speak when she found it. What followed wasn't chaos, it was clarity. A forced pause. A deep breath as people began to realize they'd placed their faith in an image, one that had been carefully protected by handlers, media networks, and a loyal circle who all had something to gain. And now, that image was crumbling. It didn't matter how many magazine covers there had been, how many honorary degrees were awarded, or how often praise had been heaped on from the highest cultural platforms. Once the mask came off, nothing could put it back on. It became evident that the system that had enabled the deception was just as complicit. The silence, the cover-ups, the media unwillingness to ask the real questions, all of it came into focus. This moment wasn't just a takedown. It was a mirror held up to a culture that loves to elevate individuals to impossible heights and then gasps in disbelief when they fall. And through it all, she stood firm. Not angry, not arrogant, just steady. She wasn't asking people to hate. She was asking them to see, to look past the glitter and the sentimentality and finally examine what was real. And in doing so, she didn't just reveal one uncomfortable truth. She shattered an illusion that had held a grip over millions of hearts and minds for decades. The truth had finally found its voice. The silence in the room was electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Everyone expected the usual, talking points, carefully worded statements, maybe a few dramatic pauses to stir up attention. But what happened next wasn't performance. It was a revelation. She didn't just talk, She brought the goods, not vague innuendo, not rumors passed around social media. She brought receipts, real, tangible, documented proof, files, transcripts, emails, financial trails, all laid out, with methodical clarity. There was no room left for speculation. What she unveiled couldn't be ignored or waved away with PR spin. It was a blow straight to the image the public had been sold for years. The presentation started quietly enough. A timeline here, a connection, there. Then came the avalanche. Documents once buried deep in obscure archives were suddenly on display. Links between major organizations and private interests were shown side by side. Emails surfaced, contradicting public statements. It was all too clear. The narrative that had been repeated endlessly on television screens, in magazine articles, and across social platforms was built on deception. And now, the truth was sitting in front of everyone, impossible to unsee. She didn't need to embellish a single thing. The facts were damning enough on their own. There were contracts with questionable terms, philanthropic efforts that masked corporate agendas, and speaking engagements that served as cover for backroom negotiations. The timeline wasn't random. It was constructed with care, connecting, dots that had always been visible, but never highlighted in this way. Each detail was like a puzzle piece falling into place, revealing a picture that had been deliberately hidden in plain sight. As each piece of evidence came to light, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What began as skepticism turned into stunned silence. Eyebrows raised, gasps were audible. These weren't half-truths or theories, they were raw, unfiltered data. It became clear that this wasn't just about one person or one event. This was about systemic manipulation, a machine that operated behind a smiling face, and a legacy propped up by manufactured trust. She walked the audience through every step of the deception. How partnerships were formed not to serve communities, but to serve power. How narratives were shaped to conceal the truth rather than reveal it. And how those at the top used their influence not for transparency, but for control. By the time the final documents were shown, no one could deny the scale of it. This wasn't just one misstep, it was a pattern. What made the moment even more powerful was the calm with which she delivered it. There was no anger, no shouting, no theatrics. Just the steady, unwavering presentation of the truth. And that calm made it even harder to dismiss. It wasn't an attack. It was an audit. The facts spoke louder than any emotional appeal ever could. They were undeniable, immovable, and devastating to the public image so many had trusted without question. There was a moment near the end of her presentation when the weight of it all seemed to hit the room at once. People weren't just hearing the facts, they were realizing what they meant. They were seeing how easily they had been misled, how thoroughly the public had been conditioned to accept a version of reality that was carefully edited and tightly controlled. The betrayal was deeper than disappointment. It was the shattering of an illusion. The media had worked overtime to shield the truth, brushing off criticism, redirecting questions, and painting any dissent as conspiracy or envy. But now, the spin in the world couldn't cover what was out in the open. The veil had been lifted. The files were real. The connections were documented. The consequences were unavoidable. This was no longer about opinion, it was about proof. And that proof was devastating. Not because it was loud, but because it was real. She didn't come to speculate. She came to expose. And with every new slide, every new revelation, she pulled back the curtain further. By the time she finished, the room wasn't just quiet. It was changed. People understood, perhaps for the first time, how deep the deception had gone. The silence wasn't confusion. It was For years, she had been shielded by a nearly impenetrable wall of media adoration, brand loyalty, and public admiration. Every appearance was met with applause. Every word spoken was treated like gospel. The image was pristine, flawless even. Any criticism was quickly dismissed as jealousy or misinformation. But what happened in that moment changed everything. Because once the truth came out, no publicist in the world could spin it away. No amount of damage control could bury what had finally surfaced. It began like any other media cycle, whispers of controversy, followed by swift denials, carefully crafted statements, and reassurances from those in her circle. But this time, it wasn't enough. The details were too specific, too carefully sourced, too damning to ignore. For the first time in a long time, there was no script that could fix it. The polished image she had maintained for decades was no match for the raw, unfiltered truth that had just been laid bare before millions. She had spent her career crafting a persona built on empathy, wisdom, and moral authority. People turned to her for guidance, trusted her opinions, and felt as though they knew her personally. But behind that well-curated brand was a web of contradictions. And now, those contradictions had been exposed in the most public way possible. The moment the story broke, social media lit up like a wildfire. At first, some refused to believe it. There was denial, confusion, even anger. But then the evidence began circulating. Documents, recordings, connections that had been hidden in plain sight. It was no longer just speculation. It was proof, and no spin doctor could rewrite it. Not this time. What followed was swift and merciless. Sponsors distanced themselves. Networks that once praised her suddenly went quiet. Influencers who once idolized her began deleting old posts. The same media outlets that had once protected her were now reporting every detail of the unraveling with brutal clarity. The shift was undeniable. She wasn't the hero anymore. She was the headline, and not the good kind. The irony was sharp. For so long, she had been held up as a beacon of truth, a guiding light for millions. But now, the very image that made her untouchable became the weight dragging her down. The public had trusted her, believed in her, even defended her. And now they felt betrayed, not because of a single mistake, but because of the sheer depth of the deception. What people couldn't shake was how deliberate it all seemed. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment or a misunderstood moment. This was a carefully orchestrated effort to protect an image, even as the reality told a different story. The contrast between who she claimed to be and what had been revealed was jarring. And for many, it was unforgivable. The backlash wasn't driven by politics or ideology. It came from a deeper place, an emotional response to betrayal. People had looked up to her. They had shaped their lives around the values she claimed to embody. And now, all of that felt like a lie. The emotional investment the public had made in her story made the fallout even more severe. It wasn't just about what she had done, it was about what she had claimed to be. This wasn't a fall from grace, it was a collapse. The fortress of public favor she had enjoyed for decades came crashing down overnight, not because of an angry mob, but because the facts spoke louder than the fiction ever could. No carefully worded apology could fix it. No interview could repair the breach. The truth had come out, and it had changed the narrative for good. In that moment, it became clear. No one is above accountability. Not even someone with decades of goodwill, global influence, and a legacy once considered untouchable. Once the proof was out there, clear, detailed, undeniable, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. The public had seen behind the curtain, and what they found changed everything. What began as a focused exposé quickly turned into something much larger than anyone anticipated. It wasn't just a single individual being called out. It was a line in the sand, a challenge to an entire system that had gone unchecked for far too long. For years, a select few had operated behind polished images and carefully orchestrated appearances, building influence not on truth, but on perception. That illusion worked because no one dared to confront it. Until now. When she stepped forward, it wasn't to start a feud or stir up gossip. It was to tear the lid off a culture of unaccountability that had been festering in the highest levels of influence. The proof she revealed wasn't just about one person's misdeeds. It was about how those misdeeds were enabled, protected, and even rewarded by a larger network of elites who thrived on keeping the public distracted and docile. The timing of the revelation couldn't have been more significant. People were already growing tired of being lectured by celebrities who lived in mansions while preaching humility. They were sick of being told what to believe by individuals who insulated themselves from the real consequences of their own actions. And here was someone willing to go right at the heart of it, not with noise, but with evidence, not with theatrics, but with precision. She didn't just highlight the contradictions in one person's narrative. She showed how those contradictions mirrored the behavior of an entire class of individuals who had positioned themselves as moral authorities, yet operated under completely different standards. It was the kind of exposure that made people stop and question everything they had taken at face value. And once those questions began, there was no turning back. The moment was bigger than the scandal. It was about who gets to control the narrative. For years, the elites had crafted their own myths, complete with redemption arcs, glossy magazine spreads, and soft focus interviews. But that carefully built machine had a weak point: the truth. And the truth had just been dragged into the open by someone who refused to play by their rules. What followed wasn't just a reaction. It was a shift. People began to speak more freely. Voices that had once been silenced or ignored were suddenly being heard. The grip that the elite had on cultural authority started to loosen, and the fear they once instilled in those who dared to question them began to dissolve. This moment wasn't fueled by rage. It was fueled by clarity. A realization that the power structures propping up public figures weren't based on merit or virtue, but on image control and gatekeeping. That realization spread like wildfire. People saw how the same techniques used to build someone up could just as easily be used to hide their flaws, silence their critics, and protect their status. The exposure wasn't just a takedown. It was a declaration. A message that no one, no matter how wealthy, connected, or adored, was above being held accountable. It wasn't about canceling someone for the sake of it. It was about confronting the truth head-on and refusing to pretend anymore. There was a strange kind of quiet after it all came out, not because the public didn't care, but because they were processing something deeper. They weren't just watching someone fall, they were watching the scaffolding around them collapse. The machine that had elevated image over integrity was finally being challenged in a way that couldn't be undone by a PR campaign or a tearful interview. And in the middle of that silence stood the woman who had started it all, not seeking applause, not asking for credit, just standing in truth, unshaken. She had taken on something far bigger than one individual. She had taken on the culture that allowed deception to flourish, and in doing so, she lit a spark that others were now ready to carry forward. The fallout was inevitable, but the clarity it brought was long overdue. For years, people had placed their trust in a carefully cultivated illusion, one built on charm, influence, and media loyalty. But no amount of fame, money, or legacy could withstand the power of truth spoken plainly and backed by undeniable evidence. What began as a single voice challenging the narrative evolved into a cultural awakening where millions began to question the systems that protect the powerful while silencing the honest. This wasn't about revenge or spectacle. It was about accountability. And for the first time in a long time, someone had the courage to demand it. Unapologetically, fearlessly, and with integrity. The evidence laid bare wasn't just a reflection of one individual's choices, but a mirror held up to a system that has for too long operated in shadows. A system where elite status excuses contradiction, where branding trumps values, and where fame is treated as proof of virtue. That illusion is now shattered. The impact rippled beyond headlines. Everyday people started to feel empowered to speak up, to demand better from those who claimed to represent them or guide them. Conversations shifted. The media, once eager to deflect, found itself forced to engage. The curtain had been pulled back, and what was revealed changed how people viewed not just one figure, but an entire class of untouchable personalities who had long operated without consequence. Truth has a unique kind of strength. It doesn't need a platform, a publicist, or a production team. It only needs a voice. And when that voice refuses to waver, even under pressure, even in the face of overwhelming influence, it wins. That's what happened here. One person's resolve dismantled a myth that had lasted for decades, not because she shouted louder, but because she spoke with evidence, with precision, and with purpose. In the end, this moment will be remembered not just for the fall of a celebrated public figure, but for the rise of a new standard, one where transparency matters more than image, and truth outweighs popularity. It's a reminder that real change doesn't come from staying silent or playing along. It comes from standing firm, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. The story is no longer about a name, a brand, or a persona. It's about what happens when people refuse to be manipulated, when they choose to see clearly rather than comfortably. The illusion is broken. The truth is out. And because of that, the culture will never be the same. That's not